Hi all, just a note before we get started. This episode of the Art Plus Music Plus Technology podcast is part of a collaboration with Synthopia.com, where we talk to inventors and artists regarding the development of highly expressive MIDI devices. You can listen to this episode from Synthopia, our website, or iTunes, and you can read the interview online at Synthopia.com. Okay, this week I have the pleasure of speaking to somebody I spoke to about 100 podcasts ago. Back in podcast number 54, I spoke with Keith McMillen of Keith McMillen Instruments, and it was an incredible opportunity to see inside the mind of a guy who really thinks deeply about the development of musical instruments and controllers and interaction with MIDI. At that time, we were talking about some of the newest work that he had done, as well as how he got around to establishing these fabrics that he uses for a lot of his sensor technology, but also how he views the future of instruments. And so it's really great as we're talking about expressiveness in instruments. It's great to kind of come back and talk to him because in many ways, Keith's team produces the tools that, first of all, are the easiest and most affordable expressive style sensors that people have access to, but also he's been doing it for quite a long time, so he's got a lot of experience in the field. So I'm really proud to be able to get a chance to talk with Keith again. Hey Keith, how are you doing?
Very good, Darwin. Always good to hear your voice.
Likewise, always good to hear yours as well. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with us. This series on expressive controllers has been really fascinating. We're getting some really interesting voices, and I'm really glad to be able to add yours to the list.
Great.
For people who maybe didn't hear the earlier podcast or have yet to go back to it, let's just do a real brief overview of the kind of tools that you've done, and especially since 2 years ago, some new stuff has come out. And so why don't we talk a little bit about some of the advances in your product line and some of the directions that you're seeing your team go?
Well, we're determined to make every traditional music playing mode capable of communicating in subtle and wonderful ways with computers. So I started this 30 plus years ago with the violin, even before MIDI. I built violins that would talk to multi-voiced analog synths that I'd built. And it just always felt unfair that the people who hit things, keyboardists, percussionists, were able to participate in the synthesizer revolution and all of the other great tools that we now have on our laptops and iPads. So we've been focused on getting all these instruments capable of communicating. I think since we last talked, we introduced the bop pad, which is a percussion head. It looks like a practice pad. It has our smart fabric sensors underneath, and it allows you to play pretty much any style. You can play with mallets, fingers, sticks, and of course, depending upon the sounds you've selected, you could be a tabla player or play a timpani. And because of the knowledge it has in terms of where you're striking, how close to the center, how far away, continuous pressure, you can get all kinds of great subtlety out of synthesis. And something I realized not too long ago is, as we're making this transition, trying to get all of the basic archetypal musical forms of play, that some people lost things once they plugged into a computer. And a drummer is a really good example. I think drummers are used to getting a lot of subtlety out of their acoustic drums and have a very intimate relationship with it. They can, use their thumbs to stretch the skin before they hit it. They had all of this subtlety. And then once they plugged in as a drum controller, they lost it, most of it. And it was reduced to the on-off basics that is, the foundation and entry point for a MIDI instrument. And it's really wonderful to watch these people light up when they're able now to play with all the subtlety and nuance on an electronic instrument that they have spent their 10,000 hours learning on acoustic instruments. So yeah, it's interesting that some people, like guitarists, have certainly lost out. Keyboard players, on the other hand, never really had an intimate relationship with the string or the pipe, and so for them, the move to synthesis control didn't surrender much. Initially it surrendered polyphony, and we soon got that fixed. That's what has caused us in the area of the keyboard to have to go beyond what was originally capable with the acoustic instrument, because they really didn't have any subtle control of pitch bend, timbre, things that are pretty basic to having gestures turn into music. And so with the keyboard, which is Keyboard Pro, it's a 4-octave keyboard with traditional size keys, and you can just walk up to it and start playing it. A lot of people within a minute or two get it, and they start accenting notes in a phrase and use the ability to bend a note with the chord held with their left hand, not bending. And basically, it's like they tell you when you learn how to drive, keep both hands on the wheel. Yeah, you can keep both hands on the keys now because it's configured as a traditional sized keyboard. There's very little transition time. And once people learn that the front of the key is a horn, the back of the key is a string, left, right is pitch, up, down is brightness, they're off and running. And it's really been great to see musicians light up. And I know others have been promoting keyboards of a higher dimensional nature. And I think it's really great that the community is aware of this and that musicians now have the ability to access all this subtlety.
Sure. It must be interesting for you when you are test driving, especially I think of with the bop pad. It must be really pretty fascinating when you're first putting this together and you first bring in people to test it out, and you see people be able to revisit percussion techniques that maybe they haven't been able to use for a decade because they started focusing on, pads and had to relinquish things like surface tension or drag functions that you can actually now reintroduce into the electronic sphere again.
It's really great. We missed a lot of smiles as people first started playing. We did catch a lot of wonderful moments in some of the videos on that site. Yeah, just like being able to do a controlled press roll.
Right.
And as you move the sticks towards the center and further away, to have the timbre change, to not have it mess up the rhythmic quality of what is a very hard to do drum technique, to make it sound beautiful and under control. To see those people come back, it's fantastic.
Very interesting. So now, where someone like a percussionist has the opportunity to revisit techniques that maybe they've had to abandon when they moved into the electronic environment, with keyboardists, you are kind of having to reinvent that almost from whole cloth. It's almost like describing a new vocabulary for people because of this dimensionality. How much do you find that players find that uncomfortable, or do you find that they lock into it pretty quickly? I ask this just because, in the course of talking to people about these expressive controllers, one of the things people often decry is that, MIDI keyboards had kind of devolved into being no more than on-off switches. And now with these new tools, we're re-implementing movement that requires some virtuosity in order to make it not sound like a train wreck, right? How do you find people are initially uncomfortable with it, or is it just such a fantastic new set of options that they dive right in?
Well, that's a good question. And it really is a broad range of reaction from the range of people we've been able to have interactions with on the keyboard. Some people, it's like it's always physically been there. And they start playing, and then they start bending notes because they've heard this. They've heard guitar players bend notes, and they've heard, timbres change over time. So it's not like, a foreign language.
Right.
They just never have been able to produce those things. A lot of people, within a few minutes, are off and running. And usually they have to stop, laugh, clap their hands, and kind of wonder if it's really happening. On the Kickstarter site for this project, we actually captured 4 people's very first playing experience. And it's fun to watch. And then, these are people, obviously, though, who are more open. They're not raised only on Bach fugues. They have some awareness of what synthesizers can do, and keyboardists really were the first ones in, since the early Moog gear had a keyboard attached to it. Right. And they had a bend wheel, and they had pedals. So a lot of people have very short learning curves in terms of adding this new functionality to their voice. And then you get people who have played certain things certain ways all their life, and they'll dip their toe into bending 2 notes opposite directions and for the first time. But then, the training takes over, and then they're just playing. But that's also good from my point of view, since it means that if someone who's a very accomplished keyboardist can walk up to our product, our keyboard, which is not normal, and just start playing their repertoire without any transition, I'm pleased with that. Many of the attempts to capture 3-dimensional gestures from a keyboard have been out there. And, you read where it takes 3 months to play in tune. And I just think that's kind of not good. You get both types. But, yeah, seeing the person light up, kind of like running into an old friend and really playing phrases with articulation and a new spirit that they haven't had before is a real treat.
Well, and it's interesting that you use the phrase coming back to an old friend, because one of the things I noticed, so since the keyboard is sort of like the easy entry port into doing MIDI data entry, people from all kinds of backgrounds end up banging away on keyboards just because that's the easiest way to do it. But one of the things I notice is when you see a guitar player using a MIDI keyboard to enter stuff, they still sort of naturally apply finger vibrato while they're playing and stuff, even though they know full well that that's not doing anything. There's something about that gives them the innate sense of playing the note rather than pressing a button, right?
Yeah, it's like Phantom Limb syndrome. Used to be there.
It used to be there. I can still feel it, I'm sure. That's pretty funny. So now you talk about making the broad range of instruments available for interaction with the computer. You have spent a fair amount of time doing things for people, for keyboardists, to give them more expressive stuff. And really the idea of having adding stroke capabilities and stuff to a keyboard is pretty phenomenal. It really opens that up to be very expressive. Doing the same with percussive is also pretty fantastic. What are the things that you're doing for? You mentioned guitar players already as having, sort of some missing pieces to their puzzle. Then you have string and wind players. How do you imagine bringing them all into the game? Is this part of your grand master plan for the future?
Yeah, it's like.
Well, there you go.
Everyone gets to get on the bus. It's like there's really no reason that just because you play a bowed string instrument that you should not have access to this incredibly fantastic technology, which is with iPad pricing. What you can get for $30 on an iPad would cause people to jump out a window 20 years ago. And everyone should be able to access these tools. Some of them are harder than others. Bowed strings and plucked strings are, in my opinion, the hardest, and they're the ones I've been working on the longest. The Zeta violin is still being used, still being produced, and used for basic MIDI entry. I have some designs that will get much more timbre and subtlety out of it. And that's been one of the problems with stringed instruments, bowed or plucked guitar, violin, is that you have to abandon that nuance.
Right.
I remember the first violinist of the Hong Kong Philharmonic was over, and he was playing a Zeta violin into a MIDI synthesizer. The guy is a phenomenal player. And I really had to say, okay, think like this. When you play that note, someone on the other side of the room has seen you play that note and pushes a doorbell button.
Right.
That's the level of intimacy string players have over MIDI. The new Stringport system, which has fret scanning, which has always been, in my book, a needed component. I had the Mir 6 synths out 20 plus years ago, and this latency thing is not acceptable. So scanning a fingerboard for a lot of play, you put your left hand down before you pluck the note. So that information gives me everything I need even before the string vibrates. Right. And then taking the timbre of the string, the brightness, just the volume, and mapping that to the synthesizer, which is what's happening with MPE, defined mappings.
Right.
All of a sudden, people start playing like a guitar as opposed to a device that enters notes into a computer.
Yeah, as my first and foremost instrument always was guitar, and I was an early user of the old Roland GR systems. This idea of having a guy across the room pushing a button, that resonates so clearly with the feeling of disconnection. The question I have is if there's a way, if you're doing fret sensing and you're doing a bunch of other stuff, is there going to be a way to do this that's practical for an instrument that doesn't require the transatlantic cable coming out of the back end in order to get it into the computer?
I certainly hope so. There are issues because it's a lot of data and you have to send all the audio, and Bluetooth at its best has about 10 to 15 milliseconds of delay. Wi-Fi is highly variable, so you get jitter.
Right.
There was ultra wideband that was proposed 4 or 5 years ago, which was essentially wireless USB, and that held a lot of promise, but they could never make it work. So I keep my eye on everything, and it's still not cost-effective and or convenient with the wireless systems that our computers have in them at this minute. Right. And with the transceivers that are readily available. With Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, even in a conversation, having 15 or 20 milliseconds of delay is not horrible. But if you're a musician, that kind of becomes a problem.
Sure.
And so I would love very much for us to, I hate cables. It'd be wonderful to free ourselves. Stringport right now is a USB 2 wire. Like I say, I'm really have my fingers crossed for wireless USB because I think they will do it right.
That makes sense. Now, talking about that, though, actually makes me want to expand our conversation a little bit further, because in addition to your work making controllers with different kinds of expressiveness, one of the other things that you've long been involved in, I would say it's a form of expression where it's more about group expression or group real-time group collaboration and interaction. I saw you work with Triometric. I saw you work with them a couple of times over the years. One time I saw a really nice, beautiful performance. You know, it's clear that you have a vision for this idea of expressiveness, not only coming from the individual instrumentalist and their virtuosity with their instrument, but now you have this vision for something that extends beyond that, where the conductor of a group or a group of musicians in a collaborative mode start to express information towards and react towards information from other people. You shared some information with me where you talked about the networking as what you think of as a primary future direction for instrumental development or group dynamic development. And it seems to me like that's another variation of expressiveness in music devices, when all of a sudden the devices open up new doors for collaboration or new doors for interaction. Can you talk a little bit in more detail about how you see that working and what your experiences with Triometric were that give you hope for that?
I think you've framed it very well. I'd say that you look back the history of Western music, there have been several major improvements, changes that are usually the result of technology getting refined, like being able to have a piano the strings don't break, can build 5 flutes that all play in tune together, that allow things like symphonies to work. And I feel that every generation, and generation could be anywhere from 20 to 100 years, produces a new technology that becomes the basis for a new music. We haven't quite done that yet. You know, you go listen to some EDM music, which is really fun to listen to and dance to, but when you leave, it's kind of impossible to even whistle a melody that you heard. There's like no synthetic soloing that would be on par with a violin solo or a guitar solo. So electronics has made us more insular in that if you want to perform a piece, you kind of need to be composer, programmer, and the performer, where in the past those functions can be done by 3 different people. And I think if we take our instruments and hook them to the most important technology of this century, which is networking, it's changed how we live, work, watch any history of science show. That's how they explain it. But it hasn't changed how we play music. And I think that is the new ocean. That's where fun will be. And so I've been keeping this as a theme, a guiding light in my work. And I was able to get a version of it up and going about 10 years ago after about 20 years of programming and modifying and improving a bunch of instruments. Basically, if I can solve the problem, I'll do it. If I can't, I'll start a company. It was fantastic. We had people writing pieces for us. The ability of one instrument to change the timbre of another, for the score to sort of sit there and hover until the bass player plays a specific line. It becomes almost like a video game in that you're interacting with the computer and you're interacting with other players, but it's music. Usually there's a score involved, there's still notes, but you get to do all of these other things. And as our computers get more and more capable, I think they'll become stronger players. People such as Ray Kurzweil and others speak of the future when a $1,000 computer will be as smart as a human. And they put it off in the 2040s. So I think that's a very good target. In order to have this work, you need to be able to get not just the audio, but the gestures and the notes and the volume and the timbre of what a person is doing on that instrument at a high level form, well modeled so that there's a number that relates to how brightly the violinist is playing or how syncopated the guitar player is, phrase following, so that the computer can respond after you've done your part. These are all really challenging technologies and require a lot of computing power, but it's happening. Think about voice recognition. Talking to your stupid phone and it actually gets it right. That's new.
What do you think the things that might actually be hampering forward movement on that? I sometimes wonder if one of the things that hamstrings advances in music technologies and music instruments is the fact that nobody can own the saxophone, so nobody wants to put that much IP into the saxophone, right?
Right.
Where, I get to own Facebook, so I'm going to pour a lot of, or, someone gets to own Facebook, and they get to pour a lot of effort into changing, writing notes to your parents into a computered paradigm. Do you think there are things like that, things on the business side that actually hamper expansion on either the technological or the artistic side?
Yeah, certainly. Let's take that same saxophone. There's really very few practical ways for a saxophone player to control a synthesizer in a meaningful manner. And that's part of the chicken and egg problem, where if the synth doesn't give you that intimacy of response that your actual saxophone does, why bother?
Right.
If you look at the history, we've had a lot of really fantastic composers who wrote pieces for synthesis and or computers along with Western musicians. And John Adams, Terry Riley, they've all given up. This is another part of what I'm working on. It's because if you write a piece that uses technology, in 5 years, no one will be able to play it. And that hurts. That's one of the things that has to change. And it's also one of the main goals of my life, is to create this environment that will allow a musical piece involving technology to be playable in 20 or 50 years. That way composers won't shy away from putting 9 months of work into something that's played once, and then at best you can listen to a recording of it. Composers like their music to have a life.
Well, and I think this gets back to where you talked about describing things in more high-level terms. That allows compositions to kind of float above a lot of different things. So not only can it float above technological changes, but it can also even float above the idea of the composition of the performing organization. So one of the things is, a Paul Simon song can be played on the piano, or it can be played on guitar,
Yep.
or you can sing it, or you can just play the melody on the top string of the guitar, and it's always still that Paul Simon song, because the description of the melody, the melody is done in sort of a high-level type way. Now, when you're doing things that are timbre-oriented, or you're doing things that have, take advantage of the kind of glitches or whatever that come out of a computer, all of a sudden it makes it very difficult for someone to say, well, we don't have a guitar synthesizer player, but we have someone who can, who could conceivably do this on a KMI 12-step or whatever,
Right.
But how does that translate? It's not always clear that can happen. And so having this higher level description and then allowing people to be able to map that to actualities seems like a pretty good play, at least for composers.
And one way that I think about it is when computers first came out and you had printers, you had one font, right? And it talked over that fat cable with something called ASCII. And then computer technology evolved, JPEG, and we begin to get PostScript. And so not only can you print an A on a page, you can add drop shadow and make it bold. And I think MIDI is the ASCII of music, in that an A is an A, if you're lucky. And but that nuance has not become part of the normal daily experience. And I think being able to play pieces in the future on different instruments, well, that just makes it normal.
Right.
Tonight, I bet I could drive less than half an hour and hear a Beethoven string quartet or a couple of them, and maybe some reductions for piano. It's lively, and pieces for electronic music generally don't have a performing life. It's not, if you look at it, the causes are fairly clear, and I believe they're treatable. Like, I can open up a 20-year-old web page. That's pretty amazing.
Right.
I think we just need to have that same ability with an electronic music score that subsumes all of the synthesis and processing and allows people to play a piece that's not necessarily written for their instrument. That's very good for the mind.
Right.
So there's a lot that has yet to happen.
That's really well stated. Now, I want to ask one more thing, and this is, we're getting close to the end of our time. Again, I appreciate you dedicating the time to talk to me about this stuff. So when I look over the work that you've done over the years, whether it's the things that you've been involved in designing, the instruments that you've built as part of companies that you've developed, or even the instruments that you choose to use yourself, you have always avoided two things. You've avoided the building a new instrument. We talked about that extensively in our last chat, but we also talked about a little earlier too, which is that there are reasons why you don't want to develop a new instrument. You believe in the pedagogy and the availability of teachers and the amount of time that people have already spent on their instruments, right?
Absolutely. I solidly stand that there will be no new instruments just because the environment's gone for that.
Right. The other thing, though, that I will say is a hallmark of your work is that you have steadfastly avoided the easy-to-use stuff. It seems like right now the music industry is a little bit awash with easy-to-use stuff. It's like I can bang my head on the keyboard and a beautiful melody is going to come squirting out. Or right. I can beat away on my pad and it'll always be in rhythm no matter how bam-bam-like I hit the thing, right?
Yeah.
You've always avoided that. And even in the things that are not exactly instrument-like, things like the 12-step or the soft step or the K-mix or the Cuneo, even things that are sort of abstracted from an instrument, there's still a lot of expression, a lot of movement, a lot of capability in there that isn't just like push a button for instant music. And I'm curious about why you've chosen that tack, because if you look at the marketplace, it seems like what people really think they want is the easiest to use possible thing. But you focused on tools for the accomplished musician. Why have you made that choice?
I think it's a good observation. I appreciate it. I think that if you look at the instruments that are easy to play, recorder, slide whistle, they just don't go very far. And a lot of electronic versions of Tickle Me Elmo instruments, they're fun and they're great for kids, but they end up in a closet. I just think that musicians who are serious about their art, and most musicians are, they want something that will grow with them or at least respects their talents. And that means it's not necessarily going to be able to be picked up and played on the first day. I remember reading an article written a long time ago by Bob Moog, someone asking him, all those wires, all those knobs, it's so hard. And he said, well, here's a violin. Let me hear what you can do.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't necessarily want to recreate the instruments I've created. So I feel if I can get all my licks in and make them cover the palette of that particular instrumental form, I won't necessarily have to go back and do it again. And I think that music, really good music persists over time and space. People pick it up and play it who didn't write it. As you mentioned, if it was written for a flute, I can play it on a guitar. It's flexible. It's welcoming. But yeah, you got to pay a price. You got to learn the language, and a lot of people have. That's my target audience, and what I want to offer them is more. I don't want to take anything away. I want to add new timbres, new possibilities to those instruments. And then for composers, I want to invite them back into the world of writing for instruments and technology. It just, there was more going on in the 60s and 70s than since.
Right.
And so while it may address no need expressed or felt right now, I do think once it's available and behaves nicely and people start writing some good pieces for it, and other people who maybe have never met the composer can download all the tools they need and play those pieces and interpret those pieces, well, then we'll have another species of living music. And it's been a long time since that's happened. I'd say 60s with popular music, rock music, was incredible. We just really haven't flipped over, the clock hasn't flipped over yet to the next one.
Right. So one last question then for you. Given that vision for what you hope composition and playing to become, if you were to give someone like me advice, I have a 10-year-old son who wants to get into music. I tried to convince him that advertising was a better route, but he didn't go for it. Plastics, son, plastics, right? But what advice would you give to a 10-year-old who's got the hunger for music? What would you give? What direction would you send them on? Would you send them on the direction of, here's an instrument that has a great potential for a future? Learn the violin or the piano or the drums? Or would you say, focus on composition because that's the gathering point for musicians? Or would you focus on production as being sort of like the locale where everyone comes together? What advice would you give to somebody if you wanted to help position them for how you see the future?
It depends on what the person is looking for. I think if music has a large social element, the stories of everyone in high school getting a red guitar so they can pick up girls, and that's valid. But if a person wants to express something that's important to them, that music being the only real-time art out there, and music would address that need, I think you have to pay your dues. I do think you can easily start with a ukulele. I think they're great. There's the 3-string guitar, the lug, and that's fun. I think anything you expose a young person to shouldn't be so challenging that it makes them give up, but it should at least be an entryway to more serious instruments and more styles that you can choose from and learn from other people. I forget what the number it is, but something like 80% of all guitars end up in the closet. And, well, that's okay. 20% of the people are still playing. Those are the people who take great enjoyment from it and find satisfaction, and are, because of that, are willing to put more time into the instrument. Yeah. I just don't know that there are shortcuts.
Right. Yeah, in a way, like you say, that those are the 20% of the people that needed the guitar, right?
Exactly.
Well, Keith, I want to thank you again for taking the time. This was a fabulous chat, as is the case every time you and I get together and talk. So thank you so much for that. congratulations on the funding of the Keyboard Pro 4. That was really encouraging to see. I had a number of friends who were just really nervous about that, and then when they saw it hit, there was great rejoicing in the land. So congratulations on that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. And so with that, though, I will let you go on with your day. Thank you so much, and have a great one.
Always a pleasure. Thanks for the time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, many thanks to Keith for the insights and the background between how he thinks about these kinds of controllers and what he thinks the future is all about. I really like this idea of every instrument having a way to interact with the computer. That does, in fact, seem like the future, doesn't it? I want to thank you so much for listening, for keeping coming back. It's been great collaborating with Syntopia on this series of expressive controllers. If you get a chance, drop them a line and let them know how much you enjoyed the series. Drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com. And let me know if you like it, if you like more, if you have other ideas for people for me to interview. But other than that, I'm going to say goodbye, and thank you for listening to this series. We'll catch you again soon. Actually, next week.